Good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to Trasna Hira for this evening's talk on an overview into the history of ex-servicemen's cottages in Callan, County Kilkenny. And your host, your lecturer will be MaryAnne Maher. Just before I go into the detail of this evening's lecture, I'd just like to give you a quick overview of the events coming up in the next couple of days, if my technology hasn't. So tomorrow evening, we have a companion talk almost to this evening's talk. It's the Ex-Servicemen's Cottages of Northern Ireland by Nigel Henderson. And this talk will look at the various styles of cottages in Northern Ireland. I will include the details of the accommodation and the men that actually were given the houses, including their biographical details of early occupants. Then on Sunday, there's an important event on here on Trasna, and it's about, does Ireland need the 1798 Rebellion Centre? And the 1798 Rebellion Centre was built, was a large-scale rebellion that occurred throughout Leinster, parts of Ulster, and even had a French exhibition that landed in Mayo. The rebellion cost the lives of 30,000 Irish men and women and saw many thousands more emigrated or transported as a result of it. Wexford County Council are now proposing to sell the 1798 Centre. Join us as we explore if the panellists feel that 1798 is worth commemorating. So, tonight's lecture is very important as it looks into a facet of our built history and heritage. The historiography of our relationship with the history of the Great War has changed over time. And, you know, like we often say that Australia has built its national identity out of Gallipoli, and Canada built its national identity out of, you know, the Second Battle of Ypres. Well, Ireland's national identity for most of the country, or large part of the country, was built in Easter 1916. And it was only we'd say, the people who were more aligned with the United Kingdom that would have seen a national identity maybe built out of particularly the Ulster counties, out of the Battle of the Somme, particularly. But falling out of this and emanating very quickly from the start of our new country, we had a scheme which was set up on both sides of the new border in order to build cottages for ex-servicemen. Tonight's talker, MaryAnne, has been on a committee member for many years of the Ballingarry Parish Journal, who will hopefully publishing their 25th edition at the end of this year. Her interest in World War I stems from having two great granduncles who were killed in the early months of the war. John Clear during the Battle of the Isan on the 20th of September 1914, and John Brennan, who was killed during the Battle of Lepille on the 21st of October 1914. She grew up in the maternal home of John Brennan in Ballintaggart, Ballingarry. She was the secretary of the Ballingarry World War I Committee, who in August 2017 unveiled a memorial plaque to the 78 soldiers, one Reverend Father and one Reverend Sister who fought or took part in World War I from the parish. So she completed the vast majority of the research into the names and has subsequently discovered 31 further names. She is also a member of the 18th Regiment of Foot, Royal Irish Regiment and South Irish Horse Association, located mostly in Clonmel, where she carries out a great deal of research into the soldiers who fought with the regiment during the war. She also carried out research on local involvement of Ballingarry men and women during the War of Independence and the Civil War. In assisting with the research she carries out, she decided in September 2019 to complete the National Certificate in Local Studies and History Studies course in Maynooth University College. So on that note, MaryAnne, I'll hand over to you to start the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Larry, for that introduction, and to Liam and the team from Trasna for the invitation to speak about the history of the ex-servicemen's cottages in Callan, County Kilkenny. Just to put things into context, because I'm conscious that there are a number of people viewing tonight that, like myself, have a keen interest in local and national history and may be interested in pursuing a history course of some sort in the future. In September 2019, I began a certificate in local history studies in the National University of Ireland, Maynooth. And as part of the course, I had to decide on a topic for our course assignment. While being a native of Ballingarry, County Tipperary, I could have decided on researching the activities around the Young Irelanders' rebellion in July 1848 in Ballingarry, or the Palatine community, or the coal mining heritage of the parish. But these are all aspects that have been covered by others extensively throughout the years. So in keeping with the World War I concept for my assignment and observing the theme of local history, I decided to look into the history of the ex-servicemen's cottages in Callan. It's a part of the history in Callan that has drawn somewhat of an element of curiosity as to their origins. While some research and reporting has been recorded locally, there was not a huge amount of primary sources or supporting documents available to carry out the research within Ireland. Therefore, the majority of my sources came from a trip to the National Archives in Kew, London, back in February, as well as the National Archives in Ireland, local publication Callan 800, companion volume, the local and national newspapers, and online records through Find My Past, Fold Tree, Irish Genealogy, etc., and a small number of previously published theses, to mention a few. Through my research and tonight's lecture, I will endeavour to bring about a new understanding to the history surrounding the cottages in Callan, as well as align this lecture with previous lectures presented by Commandant Larry Scallon from Bugle Call to Tolling Bell, Kilkenny in the Great War, Dominic Price's World War I veterans experience in Ireland, and tomorrow night's lecture, Ex-Servicemens Cottages of Northern Ireland by Nigel Henderson. So homes fit for heroes, promises, promises, promises. A total of 206,000 Irishmen served in the British forces during the war. 58,000 were already enlisted with the British Regular Army or Navy before the war broke out. 130,000 were service volunteers recruited from Ireland for the duration of the war, and 130,000 were service volunteers recruited from Ireland for the duration of the war. However, by 1915, there was a massive decline in recruitment. Factors included condemnation of the war by the Catholic Church, reports that Irish troops in the British Army appeared to have been treated with particular harshness, even by the standards of the time. By the time housing for Irish ex-servicemen began to even be considered as a potential option in 1915, the deadliness of the war was quite apparent on both sides of the battle and home fronts. Therefore, survivors of an unprecedented war deserved unprecedented compensation. The origins of the housing issue lay with Major Henry Lefroy, an Irish officer in the British Army and a recruiter during World War I. Major Lefroy noted that the recruiting rhetoric used in Ireland, exhorting Irishmen to enlist to defend their homes, had little impact because many men either had no homes or lived in substandard accommodations. Major Lefroy suggested to the Commander-in-Chief for Ireland, Sir Arthur Paget, a plan along the lines of the Labourers Act, which provided modest homes at a modest rent. Paget, in turn, passed the recommendation on to Augustine Burrell, the Chief Secretary of Ireland. Burrell agreed to draft a bill to be introduced to Parliament, and recruiting officers in Ireland were instructed to tell recruits that such a bill was in the works. When asked about the number of houses needed in Ireland in 1915, Lefroy recommended about 40,000. Additional support came when Field Marshal John French, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, beginning in May 1918, issued a proclamation as part of a new recruiting initiative in June 1918. In it, French stated, "We recognise that men who come forward and fight for their motherland are entitled to share in all that their motherland can offer. Steps are, therefore, being taken to ensure, as far as possible, that land shall be available for men who have fought for their country, and a necessary legislative measure is now under consideration." So this brings us on to Armistice 1918. The armistice that finally ended fighting on land, sea and air between the Allies and their opponent, Germany, came into force at 11 a.m. Paris time on the 11th of November 1918. This signified a victory for the Allies and a defeat for Germany, although not formally a surrender. While this marked the end of the war for thousands of Irish soldiers, the next task was to repatriate the battle-weary, the wounded, injured, and prisoners of war back to Ireland, and this was an operation that took months to complete. Following the ending of World War I, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George gave a speech in the House of Commons in which he promised to make Britain a fit country for heroes to live in. He promised homes fit for heroes. After the trauma of World War I, those returning home required jobs and homes for them and their families. Building new homes was therefore an important part of building social cohesion. Parliament passed the ambitious Housing Act of 1919, which promised government subsidies to help finance the construction of 500,000 houses within 3 years. This included Ireland. So one cannot speak about cottages in Callan without having a brief look at the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust. However, I can really only touch on some of the details tonight, as it's a lecture topic in its own right, and time constraints don't allow for such detail. My assignment covers off a comprehensive review of the trust, and I'm happy to provide anyone who is interested with the information. I'll provide my email at the end of the presentation for any queries anyone may have. So, the Land Act of 1919 allowed for the provision of land and housing for ex-servicemen. This scheme wasn't without its problems. The first was that insufficient holdings were available. Land ownership remained a sensitive issue within Ireland, and the award of land to soldiers was depicted by Republicans as a new form of plantation. The Cork Examiner in 1919 described the scheme as an attempt to create soldiers' colonies in Ireland, and predicted that it would rekindle the devastating fires of land wars. Even an ex-serviceman wrote, "The land is still there, but the same old landlord still has it, not the landless who fought for it." The second cause for complaint related to excessive purchase annuity. It was noted that immediately following the war, land prices were high, although this affected all other aspects to society. The final issues related to the issue with secured land under the scheme being prevented from building commencing on it, owing to the hostile activities of the IRA in the year 1921, therefore rendering the first year of the scheme owning the land useless. Irrespective of the opposition of the IRA and the Irish government, the impact of the British government's scheme to allocate land to Irish ex-servicemen was always going to be limited, because it lacked the financial resources and ambitions of equivalent schemes in Australia and Canada. The British government was under significant pressure in 1919 to be seen to be doing something for Irish ex-servicemen, and although inadequately funded, the announcement of the Irish Land Act helped it achieve that objective somewhat. So here on this slide, we can see the total number of houses that were either were built, were under construction, or were planned to be built in Ireland between 1919 and March 1922. Up until 1922, the building of the cottages was under the remit of the Board of Works and Local Government Board, which was proving to be slow and frustrating, with only 1,828 cottages built between 1919 and 1922. This led to much lobbying with government officials, and a total review of the process in acquiring land, offering tendering, and building of the cottages was undertaken. The Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust was constituted under the Irish Free State Act of 1922 for the provision of cottages in Ireland, with or without plots or gardens, for ex-servicemen. In 1923, however, once the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust came into effect, Parliament provided a grant to the Trust in the amount of £1.5 million, the equivalent of just over €48,500,000, to carry out the housing schemes. At the same time, back and forth discussions between the British, the Northern Irish, and the Free State determined that a total of 3,672 houses would be built in Ireland, with 2,626 for the Free State and 1,046 for Northern Ireland. The average rent for a cottage was expected to yield 5 shillings per week, the equivalent of €8.05 whereas information taken from a newspaper article published in January 1916, we discovered that a discharged soldier who was totally disabled received a pension of 25 shillings, which is the equivalent of just over €40 by today's standards, a week, and a gratuity on discharge. Men partially disabled received a grant of from 8 shillings sixpence to 17 shillings sixpence a week, the equivalent of just over €13 and between €28 a week. This allowance varied according to circumstances, and 2 shillings and sixpence, the equivalent of just over €4, was granted a week for each child. The mid to late 1920s saw a number of rent strikes by ex-servicemen in the Free State. And while the Trust had facilitated numerous rent reductions, the amount of rent continued to put a strain on the tenants. The refusal of paying rents resulted in many court cases for payment of arrears, and many cases, evictions. A case brought to the Supreme Court of Ireland ruled on the 23rd of July 1933 that the Trust, as constituted, was not entitled to charge rents to ex-service tenants. However, in Northern Ireland, the courts reached the opposite conclusion, and thereafter the Trust received no rents from tenants in the South. As a result, no further houses were built in the South after 1932, and maintenance was reduced to a minimum. In Northern Ireland, building continued, and the last house being completed in 1952. In 1961, the Trust allowed for the applications of ex-servicemen from the Second World War to purchase an Irish cottage. In 1967, the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust Act enabled the Trust to provide or assist in providing living accommodation other than cottages, and extended its powers to sell cottages to widows of former tenants. From the late 1960s, with many of the ex-servicemen advancing in years or seeking an alternative accommodation and passing away, the Trust made the decision to begin the process of selling the vacant cottages. The option to purchase the freehold by existing tenants was also an option. Most of the cottages were offered for sale at an asking price of £305. By March 1986, it was reported by the Trust that since the inception of the sale of cottages, in the South, 2,689 cottages had been sold, for which just over £2 million, or just under €3 million had been received, and 1,207 sold in the North, for which just under £4 million had been received. In 1987, the terms of the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust Act provided for the distribution of the surplus funds and made provisions for the wind-up of the Trust. Money provided by the sale of the houses was distributed to the original contributors. 3/5 of the United Kingdom's share was paid into the UK and Northern Ireland consolidated funds, and the remainder paid to the Royal British Legion. The 2/5 of the share, which amounted to just over £1,440,000, or just under €1.9 million in today's monetary value, was forwarded to the Irish government, who had agreed that the funds would be lodged into the Irish Exchequer and disposed of in a manner that the Minister for Finance, who was Ray McSharry at the time, deemed appropriate. This was ratified under the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust Act of 1988. So this here you can see a letter from the Trust to the Minister for Finance, giving them the details that they were enclosing the cheque for the £1.44 million. Essentially, this was money in the form of a rebate to the Irish Free State, and that had had no hand or part in providing these cottages in the first place. So this brings us on to the ex-servicemen's cottages in Sceochacloran and the Manans in Callan. So Sceochacloran is actually more locally known as Sceoch, so for the purpose of the presentation, we're just going to refer it to Sceoch. So considering the amount of local Callan and County Kilkenny men and women involved in World War I, 3,268 as per the Kilkenny Great War Committee, the total number of soldiers' cottages built in the county was very low. There is a total of 6 schemes in County Kilkenny. And the slide here will just show you where the schemes were and the different townslands of in each area where the cottages were. So Callan was scheme number 20, which had 25 cottages. Thomastown scheme number 6, which has 17 cottages. Urlingford scheme number 136, which is 1 cottage. And Kilkenny had 3 schemes, numbers 91, 316 and T65, which had 14 cottages, giving a total of 57 cottages for the whole county. Just on an aside, there should have been more cottages built in Kilkenny, but after the Supreme Court ruling in July 1933, it would seem that the planned cottages scheduled to be built in Lyrat, Shellamsrat and Fookstown, and the extra cottages due to be built in Middleknock were cancelled. So this slide here will just show you the 3 areas where the plans were for the extra cottages. So Lyrat, which is just out the Dublin Road from Kilkenny, had 7 sites on it. Shellamsrat, which is just out the Callan Road, had 2 sites on it. And Fookstown, which is just out the Waterford Road, had 1 site on it. So ex-servicemen's cottages, like agricultural labourers' cottages, were sometimes built along roadsides, either singly or in small loose groups of perhaps 4 to 10 cottages. But substantial compact estates and garden suburbs, some of them carefully planned, were also built on the outskirts of cities and towns. Not only was employment more readily available near towns, providing services such as water, roads and bus services was usually easier than in the countryside. However, a small number of standalone cottages can be found dotted around the country. Examples in Kilkenny include Anamalt, Dunmore, Maddoxtown, Freshford, Johnstown and Gorn. So one can readily appreciate the excitement generated by the construction of these housing schemes in the early 1920s, when the move to the suburbs was pioneered by the Trust. When one compares to the inner city public housing schemes of the early 1900s, having few rooms and no gardens, with this new development, one can appreciate the attraction of the prospect of room and space and gardens, not to mention fresh air. In the most, the design of the ex-servicemen's cottages was a semi-detached, gable-ended, 2-storey cottage, approximately 600 to 700 square feet, some slightly exceeding 1,000 square feet. Concrete block walls, then something of a new building concept, were widely used in the construction of the cottages. The design was uniform, in a rather austere appearance, with a living room, 3 bedrooms and a scullery, usually built as a lean-to at the gable end. Bathrooms were provided when a municipal water supply was available, but in many cases they were improvements made later by the Trust. This is the format of the cottages built in Callan and the vast majority of the cottages built in County Kilkenny. When Scheme 20, the Callan scheme, was originally approved, it was proposed to build 25 cottages in Blackstaff, which is a half a mile from Callan town on the Kilkenny Road. But for some reason, it was changed to Scochacloran, which is up to 1.5 miles from Callan, 10 miles from Kilkenny, but was still part of the Blackstaff farm. Local belief is that the land at Blackstaff was of better quality than that in Scoch. This map here, it's a bit hard to read, but this just shows you the original site where the cottages were supposed to be built. This is Callan town, so you can see it's obviously closer in proximity. And then obviously when this fell through, then 23 cottages were built out here in Scoch and the 2 cottages in the Manans. So you can see the major inconvenience that these 2 new locations were going to cause people travelling in and out of Callan. So 14 acres were purchased on behalf of the Trust from Messrs Pollard from Callan and 1 acre from Colonel William Mahony Butler in Manans. Manans is 1 mile from Callan town. Colonel Butler had served with the King's Own Hussars cavalry during the Second Boer War and afterwards in World War I. The plan was to build 23 cottages in Scoch and 2 in the Manans. So this slide here just gives a breakdown of the cost of each cottage and the rent expected to be yielded in pounds sterling from the cottages in Scoch. So you can see here that, say in 1920-22, the total 14 acres cost the Trust £635. which is in today's equivalent is just over 20,500 euro. The cost of the building of the total build of the cottages was £22,841, which is the equivalent just under 730,000 euro by today's standards. The weekly rent was 7 shillings a week, the equivalent of €12.91. The annual rent for the 23 cottages was expected to yield £260, the equivalent of just over 9,500 euro. By today's standards, if you took those 14 acres as a development site, the asking price would be €305,000, 25,000 per acre. So considering that the exchange from £335 to 20,000 euro, it's a bit of a bargain. And approximately 60 houses will be built on that site today instead of the 23 that were built. So very few people will be getting their half-acre back garden. The full cost of the building included drains, fencing, roads, gates, pillars, and piers. Each of the sites included a small garden front and approximately half an acre plot at the rear in order for the residents to grow fruit and vegetables. Messrs. Connolly and Callan of Kilkenny were awarded the contract to build the cottages in Callan. Instead of the conventional method of wall construction using quarried stone and lime and sand mortar, these cottages were built with concrete blocks, which were manufactured on site. The gravel used was from local pits in West Cork, Callan, owned by Walker and Grangers. A well was sunk to provide water for the site, and the well and pump were constructed by the Bergen family of Callan, who were specialists in well sinking. Gravel was transported to the site by horse and cart. The blocks for skeoch were T-shaped and L-shaped, which interlocked, forming a half cavity in the centre. These measured 24 inches long, 12 inches high, and 3 inches thick. They were exceptionally heavy. The chimney was in the centre of each semi-detached unit and had 8 flue liners, 4 per house. So this is a photograph that was sourced. There's only 2 photographs in the file for Callan, and this is one of them, which I used for the cover of my presentation. So I believe that these are cottages 8 to 1, so 8 being the closest. So you can see here the front door, there's back door, barrel here for collecting the water. This was definitely taken at the early stage of the scheme, and possibly even before anyone even moved into it. This is the second photograph, and I believe that these are houses number 10 to 15. So number 10 being the closest one on this side. The cottages had 4 rooms and a pantry with a front and back garden. There was no running water in the Skeoch and Manon's cottages. Only 60% of the overall Irish housing schemes had running water. Each house had a shed in the back garden. The roof was slightly gabled and were purloined and covered with asbestos slates, which were joined with mortar. The windows were iron framed. The trust derived no commercial advantage from its housing. Rents were sufficient, the trust claimed, only to cover administration and maintenance costs. However, from the start of the scheme, trouble was brewing in Callan, 1 in respect of the location, and 2, the rent amounts being required for the cottages. One record notes that Callan was one of the first schemes put in place after the passing of the Act in 1919, and the cottages were accordingly built before the general reorganisation of the trust in 1923. Following prolonged social and political disturbances across the country, many of the schemes were rushed to be completed or either delayed or curtailed, which resulted in a large number of ex-servicemen either emigrating or left the remainder in an impoverished condition. As a consequence, the trust found themselves burdened with 25 cottages in Callan, which in the light of later developments would not have been built. So the question is, why was there so many issues with the cottages in Callan? Or should I clarify Skeoch? There was little or no evidence of issues arising from the 2 cottages in the Manons. There was considerable difficulty in obtaining tenants, and those who eventually occupied the cottages were not of any selected class. In May 1924, a report noted that the cottages had been completed in September 1922, with initially only 15 of the 25 cottages being occupied. The inspector who acquired these tenants noted that he could not find applicants for the other 10 cottages that were prepared to pay the rent of 5 shillings a week, as well as rates. Efforts had been made through central organisations of ex-servicemen and by advertisement to find tenants for the vacant cottages. In May 1923, the tenants were still refusing to pay any more than 2 shillings and 6pence a week. The tenants' representatives had on several occasions been communicating with the trust with a view to getting them to recognise their obligation, but to no effect. On the 16th of May 1923, the tenants were advised by the trust that their refusal to pay rent should be taken as a surrender of their tenancies and the cottages sold to the highest bidder. By August 1924, the trust was beginning to lose patience with the non-payment of rent by tenants in Callan. A meeting by representatives of the trust and residents was organised, and it would seem that the meeting was positive and an arrangement was made in arranging rent payments as well as the payments of arrears. This meeting coincided with Colonel Butler's letter to Major Lefroy on the 9th of August 1924 to address many concerns. Colonel Butler advised Major Lefroy that it is next to near impossible for these men to pay the rent that these cottages are worth, because there are issues with these men getting consistent employment, even during the summer, with most only getting employment for up to 4 days as farm labourers. However, they are not employed on wet days or during the winter. He made an interesting comment in relation to the location of the cottages in Skeoch. He felt that it would have been more beneficial if they had been scattered in pairs like the ones in the Manons, out in the countryside beside farms. If this had been the case, men would have had a better opportunity to get employment as labourers as with local farmers. He noted that this had been suggested in the first instance of the building of these cottages. He stated in this letter that there were many ex-servicemen not yet in receipt of a military pension. Therefore, the rent of 4 shillings per week was an additional burden, along with paying rent, rates and taxes, meant that some tenants struggled to support their families. In a review of Colonel Butler's letter and an assessment of the situation in Callan, the trust agreed to the reduction of the rents from 4 shillings to 3 shillings per week, along with an additional 1 shilling per week additional payment to claw back the arrears. As per the report dated the 21st of August 1924, where Sir Brian Maher was quoted as saying, "In this case, I would approve of the reduction to 3 shillings per week, but only because it is either that or nothing." So did this agreement resolve the rent issues in Skeoch? In August 1924, the trust appointed William Bryans, a tenant, as the rent collector on the condition he paid a bond of £25, just a little under €810 in today's monetary value. Interestingly, considering the cottages were only completed in September 1922, there is a letter from William Bryans to the trust dated the 1st of December 1924, in which he notes that the condition of these cottages was almost making them uninhabitable during the winter months, with shores blocked and plots flooded. It was also pointed out there were issues with sickness and efforts by the local doctor to get access to visit the area. Also, an interesting choice of word, camp, was noted, which is significant considering a number of ex-servicemen had been prisoners of war during World War I. In February 1925, it transpired that William Bryans had absconded. A tenant, Barry, reported to Inspector Murphy in March 1925 that while he had not received a rent book, he had been paying William Bryans his rent since August 1924. The trust advised Inspector Murphy that the amount of default for Callan was £57 5 shillings, which is just over €2,600, and asked him to investigate. William Bryans made contact with the trust on the 19th of March 1925 to advise that he had actually not absconded but was away looking for work. On the 21st of March 1925, Callan Gardaí arrested William Bryans. It was discovered under the investigation by Inspector Murphy that William Bryans had placed 2 tenants, an F. Smith and an M. Clancy, in occupancy in 2 houses without notifying the trust. On the 23rd of April 1925, under court proceedings, William Bryans' sentence was adjourned for 1 month to allow him the opportunity to pay the £57 5 shillings. William Bryans undertook to pay £5 in 2 weeks. Inspector Murphy was hopeful that William Bryans would repay the full amount as sentencing was pending. He noted, if William Bryans goes to jail, any chance of his repaying the amount would be forgone. In July 1925, Inspector Murphy had issued a report to the trust into his investigation into the defaulted rent of £57 5 shillings. And his findings included: 1, William Bryans should not have been allowed to collect rent until the bond that had been paid, and sufficient pressure should have been made by the trust on him to produce evidence of same. 2, that the department had apparently not given tenants periodical notice of arrears. Otherwise, the tenants would have advised that they were paying rent to William Bryans. 3, the department should not have assumed that no rent was being paid. 4, that the tenants must have been in error in stating that Major Lefroy informed them that all arrears would be written off. And 5, that the department should have kept in closer contact with the Callan scheme due to the terrible state of the rent collection, and that officials should have visited the Callan area. In August 1925, the trust issued a document into the state of affairs relating to the rent payments in Callan. The duty of a rent collector was to issue official receipts to tenants for payments made and to render a weekly return of collections to Dublin. Therefore, it was acknowledged that the hiring of William Bryans as rent collector was appointed on the spot. It was a desperate but unfortunate endeavour to collect the rents in Callan. It was acknowledged as a bad decision, as William Bryans had been secretary of the local legion, who had been engaged in efforts to bring about a rent strike throughout the scheme of the trust. So, following the Supreme Court ruling in July 1933, adjudging that the tenants were not liable to pay rent. I think I've gone too far, sorry. The issue about non-payment of rent continued, and on the 17th of November 1925 in Callan Courthouse, there was a civil case taken by the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust against tenants William Bergen, Thomas Fanning, Nicholas Walsh, James Power, and Philip Preston for arrears of rent. Judgment was found in favour of the trust, and the judge was scathing in his assessment of the case, noting that if the tenants could not pay what they were being asked, then let them clear out. So in this slide here, you can just see that these are the 5 tenants that were brought up, and this was the actual amount of rents that was owed by them. By December 1930, it was recorded in a letter to the trust that £49, just under €2,500, equivalent in 2020, had been accounted for by William Bryans, and that it was advisable to the trust to write off the balance of £9.18, equivalent just over €500, as it was deemed irrecoverable. Following the Supreme Court ruling of July 1933, adjudging that the tenants were not liable to pay rent would have brought about so much relief to many of the ex-servicemen and their families. Over the years in Callan, ex-servicemen aged, moved into town or elsewhere, or as in many cases, many of them passed away. Once a cottage became vacant, the trust advertised for tenants. Sometimes you will find, depending on the year, the advertisement ran for many weeks and even months. Between 1957 and 1979, the trust discussed options in regards to the sale of the vacant cottages. The vacant cottages were offered to Kilkenny County Council to purchase, but they declined, noting that they had issues themselves finding tenants for their own houses. The tenants in the cottages were offered the option to purchase the freehold of the cottage for £250 instead of the £306 of the market price for them. Even though many of the existing tenants had been offered the opportunity to purchase the cottages, only a few tenants availed of the opportunity, most likely due to the condition of the houses. Up until the 1960s, there was still no running water or sewerage installed in the cottages. Finally, the trust agreed to offer the houses for sale on the open market. The director reported that these cottages were offered by the legal agents and that the auctioneer reported no bids. The price asked was £350 plus legal costs. By 1979, most of the cottages had been privately sold by the trust. And currently there are only 2 cottages occupied by descendants of an ex-serviceman, Michael Corcoran, number 17 in Skeoch, and Michael McCormack, number 2 in Manans. So this is a list that was compiled and has been previously published in local publications, and it was actually forwarded to me generously from a person in Callan, but I didn't actually use it in my assignment because I wasn't totally convinced that it was an accurate list, as I know that there's some names missing from it, but it just gives an idea of the amount, you know, in each cottage, the amount of people that have kind of passed, or ex-servicemen that have actually passed through them. Some have had 4, some have only had 1, etc., etc. So this is a current photograph of cottages number 21 and 20. There's been little or no change to these particular ones other than a lick of paint. And these are the 2 cottages in the Manans. Again, not a major change to the front of them, but extensions to the back and a slight change to the side of number 2. And this is just to give an idea of the cluster. We were hoping to replicate the original one here that was taken in 1922, but other than climbing into someone's garden to take a picture, we couldn't quite do it that way. So it just gives an idea of the actual cluster of the 8 houses along, so number 1 to number 8. And this is just an overview of the site. Nothing has changed in nearly 100 years. So this is taken from the OSI maps of Skeoch, and this is the original plan that was set out by the trust. And this is just the one then for the Manon. So again, there's been no change whatsoever to the site in nearly 100 years. So this just brings us on to some of the ex-servicemen that occupied cottages. So I've picked 4 for the purposes of tonight's lecture. 2 of them I included in my assignment, and 2 are 2 that I actually wanted to include, but I didn't have the space. So the first one is for cottage number 1. It's James Durney. And he was the son of Patrick and Anastasia Nee Kelly, and he was born on the 10th of December 1882 in Bridge Street in Callan. James Durney married Bridget Guilfoyle, who was also from Bridge Street in Callan, in the Church of the Assumption, Callan, on the 27th of January 1913. They had 3 children. Patrick was born on the 25th of November 1913. John was born on the 13th of April 1915, and Anastasia was born on the 1st of March 1917. We know that James enlisted with the Royal Irish Regiment with the 4th Battalion on the 4th of December 1916, and his service number was 5779. We also know from research that he was wounded at least twice, once in August 1917 and in November 1917. The sad fact is that while James was serving with the British Army in France, his wife Bridget died on the 18th of March 1918 from pulmonary tuberculosis, not that uncommon at the time. This left 3 young children, all under the age of 5 years, without their mother and their father away deployed in France. His pension ledger shows that he received on separate occasions a gunshot wound to the head and chest, which resulted in him being recorded as having 100% disability. Between 1919 and 1922, his pension fluctuated between 50 shillings and 16 pence to 63 shillings and 6 pence per week. He was one of the first occupants in the soldiers' cottage. James was in cottage number 1, which in essence was the furthest away from Callan town. And considering he was deemed to be between 80 and 100% disabled, this must have been an onerous task. James married for a second time to a Mary Keogh from Kilbride, Callan, on the 24th of January 1929. I've been unable to locate any source as to when James or Mary died, or when they moved, or if they moved out of Skeoch. But just to anyone that's interested in looking up anything about a soldier, these are one of the most invaluable records that you will actually find in relation to a soldier's, their pension file. The Western Front Association are uploading these on a continual basis, and they're invaluable to any of us that are currently or have looked up the history of a soldier. Will give you their service records, their marital status, when they were discharged, an address, possible injuries, and then on this side here then will tell you what their disability percentage wise was, and the details of their pension amount on a weekly basis. It's not free, but if you're a member of the Western Front Association, you can get access to them, or if you have full tree, they're available on that too. So the second cottage is cottage number 10. And this was Philip Preston, who was born on the 17th of April, 1889, to Thomas Preston and Honoria Nee Kiley, from Boolia the Commons, Ballingarry, which is my own parish, County Tipperary. He married Honoria Kelly on the 20th of September 1914 in the Church of the Assumption, Ballingarry. We do not know when he enlisted with the Royal Irish Regiment, 2nd Battalion, but his service number was 3992. His qualification date is given as the 25th of January 1915, and he gives his address as Kells, County Kilkenny. His brother Thomas was also enlisted in the Royal Irish Regiment, 7th Battalion, and his service number was 4768. Philip is recorded as suffering with rheumatic fever in February 1915, a burn on his left foot in April 1915, and was wounded again in July 1916. Philip was captured as a prisoner of war during the Battle of Ronsay on the 21st of March 1918, along with his brother Thomas. Both were repatriated back to England, where they arrived on the 26th of November 1918, 15 days after armistice. Philip's pension record notes that he was suffering from shell shock. He was deemed to have 30% disability and was awarded a pension amount of 12 shillings and 7 shillings 1 pence for the 2 children he and Nora had. Philip was one of the early occupants into the cottage in Skiock, and as already recorded, Philip was involved in a court case in which he and 4 other tenants were sued for non-payment of rent. His wife Nora died on the 20th of August 1950, aged 55, and Philip died on the 15th of December 1951, aged 63. His address is recorded as Skiock, and his occupation is an army pensioner. This is just an example of the POW records that you can get online. Again, another invaluable source of information. It's cottage number 18 and 19. This is William McLaughlin, and he was born on the 13th of June 1896 to Edward McLaughlin, a labourer, and Margaret Nee Gunning. The address recorded at the time of William's birth was 5 New Kilmainham, Dublin. While William's service records did not survive the Blitz attack during World War II, from his medal index card, we can see that his qualification date was the 26th of July 1915. William was wounded on the 26th of July 1917, and he was discharged from the British Army on the 28th of October 1918, 2 weeks prior to armistice. From William's pension file, we can see that he was diagnosed with neurasthenia, a condition that causes fatigues, headache, and irritability. His disability was deemed at 30% in 1919, which qualified him for a weekly pension of 12 shillings. But in September 1920, this was reduced to 20%, which also resulted in a decrease in his weekly pension from 12 shillings to 8 shillings. It's a lot of money at that time. On his return to Dublin, William was employed in Granger's pub. He married his first wife, Annie McMahon, nee Tracy, on the 13th of September 1920 in Rathdrum, Dublin. Her first husband, Anthony McMahon, who had been a private with the Connacht Rangers, had been killed during World War I on the 13th of September 1914. He moved with Annie into one of the ex-servicemen's cottages in Skiock, and it is believed it may have been number 19. Following the death of his wife in early 1957, William remarried to Margaret Campion in Thomastown on the 15th of June 1957. He and Margaret moved to Kildare into an ex-servicemen's cottage, but only stayed there for a short while before returning to Callan, where they moved into ex-servicemen's cottage number 18 in Skiock. William and his wife Margaret reared their family in the cottage in Skiock. William died on the 29th of November 1965, aged 69, from pulmonary thrombosis. Following Margaret's death in 1975, cottage number 18's freehold was privately sold on the 11th of November 1976. William's 1915 star, British War Medal, Victory Medal and Silver War Badge, along with his service certificate awarded on discharge from the Army, are on display in James Stephens Barracks Museum in Kilkenny. And the final soldier is William Woodgate, and he was in cottage number 20. So William Woodgate was the son of William Woodgate and Bridget Mooney, and he was born on the 22nd of April 1881 in Mill Street, Callan. William enlisted with the 5th Battalion Militia, the Royal Irish Regiment at Kilkenny on the 17th of June 1898, and he served in the Boer War with the 1st Battalion between 1899 and 1902. His service number was 3576. William married Kate Buckley at Kilmanagh, County Kilkenny on the 26th of April 1906. He re-enlisted in Tipperary with the 4th Battalion on the 26th of July 1908. He was promoted to Sergeant on the 14th of June 1913. He mobilised with the 4th Battalion on the 8th of August 1914 and was posted to the 2nd Battalion on the 7th of October 1914. William was captured on the 20th of October 1914 during the Battle of Lapilly, along with 9 other Callan men, E. Power, P. Russell, M. and P. Roach, M. Dooley, F. Holleran, N. Walsh, J. O'Shea, P. Norman, and later joined by Joe Lanigan. He was held as a prisoner of war in Limburg, Germany. His wife Kate was not advised of him being missing until the 14th of April 1915 and of his capture until the 11th of June 1915. He was repatriated to London General Hospital Camberwell on the 18th of August 1918, travelling via Holland. He was posted to the Royal Irish Regiment Depot in Clonmel from the 13th of October 1918, and he rejoined the 4th Battalion at Durrington Camp on the 15th of October 1918. He was discharged as no longer physically fit on the 28th of October 1918 and was granted a weekly disability pension of 16 shillings 3 pence, and his character was rated as very good. He resumed residence in Callan. He was employed post-war at Callan Post Office and was an avid angler and follower of the local football and hurling teams. William Woodgate was the uncle to 2nd Class Private Thomas Joseph Woodgate, who was attached to the 23rd Training Squadron, the Royal Air Force, who drowned on the RMS Leinster when it was torpedoed on the 10th of October 1918 off the coast of Dún Laoghaire. He is recorded as the youngest Irish casualty of World War I, being only 14 years of age when he died. William died on the 17th of April 1954, aged 72, where his death certificate records him as a telephonist and an ex-British soldier. His address is noted as West Cork, Callan, and he's buried in Kilbride Cemetery. His wife, Kate, died on the 8th of March 1955. So, homes fit for heroes, promises, promises, promises. So was the Callan scheme a success or a failure? After suffering the horrors of World War I, many returning soldiers, sailors and airmen were expecting the world to be a better place, where their life could return to some normality in a secure and safe environment and jobs for all. This was in part due to the promise made by recruitment officers from 1915 of a home for returned soldiers. This expectation was further raised by a speech by David Lloyd George the day after Armistice, where amongst other promises, he said there would be homes fit for heroes, homes and not just houses, fit implying built to a standard, and heroes giving a sense of gratitude and deserving. Dreams never met reality. And what David Lloyd George actually said was, habitations fit for the heroes who have won the war, which is a lot less punchy and emotive than the phrase everyone remembers. And the word habitations suggests something very basic. The press could not fit that sentence in a header in a newspaper column, so naturally shortened it to the phrase we now know. So what was the result of this promise? Were those houses built all over the country immediately after the war? It will come as no surprise to anyone listening here tonight that the reality fell a long way short of the promise. The legislation that followed was well-meaning and quite well thought through, but was hampered by many problems. The political climate at the time, the lack of funds, and the extreme shortage of building industry of skilled manpower and materials for a start. There were, however, many other flaws, in particularly having reviewed the case in Callan. These involved such problems as the site in Blackstaff that was originally decided on being changed, moving the site for the cottages further away from Callan town, and also involving the splitting of the sites into two, Cloran and Manons. While the plan was in essence a new concept, technically the building of a village on the outskirts of Callan, it did not provide the provisions needed for these veterans to survive, i.e. shops, dispensary. The cottages built on the site in Skioch were constantly flooded due to poor drainage. The veterans in Skioch, due to the clustering, struggled to obtain employment, whereas this seemed to be less of an issue with those cottages in the Manons, as these cottages were built in or around a number of farmers. As Callan was one of the earlier schemes in the country, many lessons, it would seem, were learned by the Trust. There were no such clusters of cottages built in County Kilkenny. The vast majority of the cottages were either standalone or semi-detached in the main, with the exception of Middleknock, Kilkenny City, which is 2 lots of 4 cottages. Because of the rural nature of these cottages, veterans were more inclined to supplement their pension with labouring work, mostly with local farmers. What is identified from the research is that the fundamental broken promise of a home for heroes did not materialise. It was the belief that these cottages were free gratis for service rendered. However, this was far from the agreement. For many veterans, depending on what their pension paid, or in some cases no pension, were expected to pay anything from 33 to 50% of their weekly pension or weekly salary. This is one of the reasons one can see the strike essentially from the beginning to not pay rent. Even after the Supreme Court judgment, adjudged that the tenants were not liable to pay rent, there was no provision made by the Trust to offer a rebate to those who had paid their rent since 1922. What was the implications of this judgment? Well, the key factor was no further cottages were built in Southern Ireland. Having decided that 40,000 cottages would be the proposed amount required, in the end only 10% of those were built, a fraction of the amount required. This meant that ex-servicemen would have to go on a waiting list to acquire a cottage, waiting for the death of a tenant or a tenant to move. Many ex-servicemen had to move from their native county to acquire a cottage. And by the time many of these cottages became available, the interest in an ex-serviceman availing of it just wasn't there. While the promise of a home for a hero was a noble concept, in fact, there are many groups of servicemen and women, as well as families, who missed out on the scheme. For example, munitions employees, nurses did not qualify. And in possibly the most unfair group were the widows and families of those who were lost to the war efforts. In fact, the majority of these widows were tenants in cities, towns, villages and rural areas across Ireland, and while receiving a pension, would have had to possibly pay out between 30 and 50% of the amount in rent, whereas ex-servicemen and their families were living rent-free after 1933. It's not all a failure. The thing is, these cottages were designed to last. The Trust, it can be agreed, initiated the concept of social housing. This was followed through by local government, although one would question the fact of whether lessons were learned from 100 years ago building houses on substandard land. It did, however, provide housing for many men and their families, when in fact the local and national government effectively turned its back on them. It provided a support network for the Callan scheme. Even by reviewing the rent dispute and subsequent court case, it did seem that the majority of tenants were united in their efforts. The cottages in principle provided self-sustainability to ex-servicemen, with a plot of land at the rear of the cottage to grow vegetables. The supporting records in the National Archives in Kew, while it didn't give me a complete list of ex-servicemen who occupied the cottages in Callan, it doesn't take away from the research. But it would have given an extra insight into the men who lived in the cottages. There are many reasons to believe the scheme was a failure. In truth, these cottages are still in existence, and the testament to them is that out of 25, there are 2 cottages inhabited by descendants of 2 ex-servicemen, number 17 in Skioch and number 2 in Manons. Even now, driving around the county and further afield around Ireland, even with elements of modernisation, it is still easy to spot the design of these cottages and remember that at one time an ex-serviceman once lived in it. Fundamentally though, The promise of homes for heroes, for those who returned from World War I, was broken. And this left many veterans homeless, destitute, and suffering with the side effects of the war, either physically and or psychologically. In conclusion, the passage of time has allowed so many of us to reflect on the sacrifices of those who died during World War I. However, in many ways, we are slowly re-engaging with our past history of World War I and remembering those who survived, came back and lived in our communities. For many, it is a new discovery. In a recent online lecture called From Bugle Call to Tolling Bell, Kilkenny in the Great War by Covenant Larry Callan, during it he noted that memory is best achieved by memorials, and the memory effect of these memorials is to trigger a memory, to recall a loved one or event in the past. This has been achieved in spades in County Kilkenny with the unveiling of a plaque in Callan to those from or who subsequently lived in the parish, and separately also in Kilkenny City to all those from Kilkenny County who were involved in World War I. In some way, I hope that by researching the cottages in Callan, it might ignite some memories and acknowledgement of the local ex-servicemen who lived in the cottages, not just in Callan, but in the many cottages scattered all over the country. That's my contact email address as we have come to the end of my presentation. And if anyone would like to make contact with me, anyone's looking for any information from my either presentation or from my assignment, I'm absolutely more than happy to pass on the details or help anyone with any research they're trying to do. So thank you to everyone for tuning in, and back to you, Larry.
Thank you very much, MaryAnne. Just to check to see you can hear me. Yeah, you can hear me. MaryAnne, that was a fantastic presentation about a piece of our built heritage that I suppose lots of us drive past every day, and we don't realize that 100 years ago, or almost 100 years ago now, actually 100 years ago now, people were moving into those houses, and in an exciting time for them personally, but unfortunately the condition in the houses, or the houses, particularly the ones in Shock, and the suitability of the site itself seems to have caused a lot of issues. And I just pick on Private McLaughlin there. Over half of his pension would have been required to actually pay his rent. Very, very difficult and emotive. But look, you packaged it so well, and I believe that this is going to become a go-to reference for people who are developing an interest in the houses for heroes. And in every county in Ireland there are houses, so you will become a reference repository of it, no doubt. MaryAnne, I'll just go through. There's loads and loads of comments here and some questions, and maybe a few answers as well. And I'll go straight to them now, if that's okay with you. The first one is from, if I can get to stop jumping around, is from Neve. And Neve asks, were the distribution of houses between north and south indicative of the distribution of recruits who served in the First World War?
Can't hear. I couldn't hear you.
Hear me?
Can't hear.
Okay. I don't know what's wrong. Can you hear me now?
No.
No?
And MaryAnne, can you hear me? Because I can hear Larry okay.
I think she's after having a problem, Lee.
Oh.
Can you hear me, MaryAnne? Can you hear me? Liam, can you hear me, bud?
No.
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly, Larry. Yeah, it's grand.
Right.
So,
okay, we have a problem.
MaryAnne message. I think
we have a problem with MaryAnne. Will I just read out some of the comments, Liam, just to...
Yeah, if you could, that'd be great, Larry. Thanks a million.
Okay. Right, so from Noreen, brilliant, MaryAnne, excellent research. My husband's grandfather and family lived in a soldier's house in Bray, County Wicklow. From Donald Crohan, thanks, MaryAnne, well done your research. and presentation tonight was excellent.
Trust me.
From iPad to everyone, thank you, MaryAnne. From great presentation, MaryAnne. Fantastic work, MaryAnne. Thank you, MaryAnne, very good. And then I'll just go back up here and maybe if I can go through a couple of the questions, and MaryAnne might get them in the future. How did they choose the families who got houses in the end? Was it like a lottery?
I can hear you now.
Do you just want to take that one, MaryAnne, because there's a bit of feedback. I know you're probably catching up on your phone or whatever. There's a little bit of feedback. So
I can hear now, yeah.
Perfect. If you just want that question.
Sorry, do you want to ask the question again? Oh no, that's terrible. Yeah, I'll leave this one.
Or even, MaryAnne, just as a suggestion, because the technology is getting complicated, did you just want to take the questions yourself off the chat box, if you can see those, and answer a couple of those? I think we've lost MaryAnne for the moment. Larry, do you just want to keep going? And hopefully she'll join us again. And even if she picks up 2 or 3 questions at the very end, it's been a fantastic presentation. Hi, MaryAnne, you're back.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can. That's perfect. Yep.
Oh, seriously.
Isn't technology terrible? Yeah, MaryAnne, if you just want to pick up a couple of questions out of the chat box and answer those at the very end, is that okay?
Can you hear me? No, go back.
Can you hear me, MaryAnne?
No, I think we can all hear MaryAnne, but MaryAnne can't hear us.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Just want to run through the rest of the comments there.
Yeah.
Larry. And if there's any questions, you can jump in on there.
Yeah.
Yourself, feel free to answer them.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks, Larry.
Okay, Liam. This is from yourself, Liam. Would, in your opinion, MaryAnne, have there been an expectation from those who signed up for service that they would have a home to come to upon return to Kilkenny post-service? Was there not public outcry across the country that this didn't materialise? There may well have been an expectation that a house should be available, but I don't think anybody could have expected there to be like instantaneously many thousands of houses. I think it was an unfulfillable promise that was made in order to advance recruitment post 1916, particularly in Ireland, as the Easter Rising had its own effects on the country. But the promise of land and a house certainly led there to being an increase in recruitment in Ireland, particularly in the middle of 1918, which you might not have expected otherwise. The applications were, oh sorry, this is Nigel coming across, and it is true that particularly from the perspective where houses were highly sought after, an application was rated according to a variety of conditions, including service rank, receipt of established pension, current living conditions, and the size of family, so on and so forth. But as we saw already with MaryAnne, actually the problem was in Callan that people didn't want to occupy the cottages, particularly when they were in poor conditions from a flood point of view, no running water, and the fact that only after 1933 would the houses have been full because they wouldn't have had to pay rent. I'll keep going here. Very, very interesting to see if a list has been compiled that includes all of these cottages in other parts of the country. That's a big one. I don't think there is a complete list, and I'm sure MaryAnne would say that the only place where you can get the full list of information is actually from Kew in the UK and London. You would have to go and research. It's not available digitized even. You have to go and look for the box. Stan Clark says, I'm not sure what documentation is available for the schemes in the Irish Free State. That was in 1920, I suppose. There may be documentation in the National Archive in Ireland. I don't think there is. Number 15 and 16 were the only houses built facing the opposite way. That's an observation from somebody that obviously lives there, which is obviously true. The person that's listening from iPad, my sister Pauline Rochford, still lives at number 6. Thank you from Patrick. Thank you for an extremely well-researched and detailed presentation. From Stephen Miller, thank you for a very interesting history. From Gary, also number 6, my wife is Pauline Rochford, Thomas Rochford's granddaughter, and obviously that's relating to a descendant who still lives in one of the houses. Maybe just research that hadn't popped up for MaryAnne.
Hi Larry, I think we might have MaryAnne back online there. So we have a couple of questions left for her. I think she's keen to jump in.
Okay, MaryAnne, all yours. You can't hear.
No. Yeah, no, I'd say just keep going. I think there's
right. I'll just do two or three more if that's okay. Very interesting. I live in number 22. Great information. That's from Tommy Stewart. And from Galaxy A10, number 16 on the list of people who lived in it is correct. My dad, Pat Foran, bought it in the early 1970s and was left for years. When he bought it, it was all overgrown with trees, etc. From what he was told, Carneys lived there before him. So that's kind of it. There's a lot of more comments. I'm sure MaryAnne will get to read them later on, and maybe she can contact people. But if anybody has a comment or an observation or a question, MaryAnne's email is on the last slide of her screen show. So with that then, Liam, I'd say we'll leave it if that's okay with you.
Super. Thanks so much, Larry, and thanks so much to MaryAnne. That was a brilliant presentation, and we'll just cut it there. Sorry we missed out on your last contribution at the very end, MaryAnne. We'll get you back another time. I think you got the essence of it out there. Thank you so much.
Thanks a million. Bravo.